In March 415 AD, the most accomplished mathematician in the ancient world was pulled from her carriage in the middle of the day, in the center of one of the largest cities on earth, and killed. The man who organized it was made a saint. That is not a metaphor. That is the institutional record. Every civilization tells a story about how knowledge dies. The burning library, the lost manuscripts, the Dark Ages descending like weather, impersonal, inevitable, nobody's fault. We inherit that story because it is the most comfortable version. It asks nothing of the institutions that survived. The uncomfortable version has a name, a date, and a chain of command. Her name was Hypatia of Alexandria. She was approximately 60 years old. She had been teaching mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy in Alexandria for 3 decades. Her students included Roman governors, Christian bishops, and the most intellectually ambitious minds of the late Roman world. She was not a symbol. She was not a martyr waiting to happen. She was the political and intellectual center of gravity of a city that Rome considered the second most important in the empire. She was killed because of what she knew, not what she believed. What she knew, and who she was advising. The official version calls it a riot, a mob, an explosion of religious tension in a city already under pressure. Tragic, regrettable. The kind of thing that happens when civilization starts to fray. That version was constructed by the same institution that constructed her killer's sainthood. What the contemporary record actually shows, written in the same year by a Christian historian with no motive to invent it, is something that looks nothing like a riot. It looks like an operation. And in 416 AD, the Roman imperial government issued an emergency edict restructuring the organization that carried it out, because Constantinople had received the reports and understood exactly what had happened. That edict is in the Codex Theodosianus. It has been there for 1600 years. Almost no one has connected it to her name. That connection is what this video is about. Socrates Scholasticus wrote it down in 415 AD, not a century later, not a reconstruction, the same year it happened. A Christian historian, writing in Constantinople with no reason to invent what he recorded and every institutional reason to minimize it. His account is contained in Historia Ecclesiastica, Book 7, Chapter 15. It names the location, it names the method, and it names the organization responsible. The Parabalani. Most people have never heard that word. That's not an accident. The Parabalani were officially a Christian brotherhood, established to care for the sick and transport the dead in Alexandria. They were licensed by the church. They reported, in practice, to the Bishop of Alexandria, and by 415 AD, according to imperial records preserved in the Codex Theodosianus, they numbered in the hundreds and had become what Roman authorities in Constantinople.
Enjoying the story so far? Subscribe to Untold History and keep discovering the past they never told.
Were already describing in formal dispatches as a private paramilitary force operating inside an imperial city. Socrates Scholasticus doesn't call them a mob. He describes a coordinated action led by a man named Peter, a lector of the church, who organized the interception of Hypatia's carriage on her regular route through the city. She was pulled out. She was taken to the Caesareum, a church, formerly a temple, in the center of Alexandria. And there she was killed. The method recorded by Socrates is specific. She was stripped. Her flesh was scraped from her bones using ostraca, tiles or shards of pottery. Then the remains were burned. This is not a mob that got out of hand. This is a sequence, a location, a tool, a disposal method. Socrates Scholasticus was not a pagan defending a pagan. He was a Christian chronicler who found what happened to Hypatia sufficiently documented and sufficiently disturbing that he included it in a history of the Church. He attributed the act directly to Cyril's influence. His exact phrasing describes the event as bringing great reproach upon Cyril and upon Alexandria itself. A Christian writing about Christians, calling it a reproach. That document has existed since the 5th century. It was never hidden. It was never lost. It was copied and preserved in monasteries across the Byzantine world for 1,000 years. What was hidden was the question it raises. If the source is contemporary, Christian, and uncontested, why does the version most people know describe what happened to Hypatia as a riot? The answer involves what the official record was designed to protect. But before that, there's Synesius of Cyrene. Alexandria, in the 4th century AD, was the closest thing the ancient world had to a research university. The library, or what remained of it by that period, was less a single building than an intellectual infrastructure. A tradition. A network of scholars, lecture halls, and institutional memory that had been accumulating for 700 years. The city sat at the intersection of Greek philosophy, Egyptian mysticism, Roman administration, and Jewish theology. Ideas moved through Alexandria the way money moves through a financial capital. In every direction, at speed, with consequence. It was the kind of place that produced Hypatia. She was the daughter of Theon of Alexandria, himself a mathematician and the last known member of the museum, the scholarly institution attached to the library. Theon edited and preserved Euclid's Elements. He wrote commentaries on Ptolemy's Almagest. He was, by any measure, one of the most rigorous mathematical minds of late antiquity. And he raised his daughter inside that tradition. By the time Hypatia was an adult, she had surpassed him. She taught mathematics, astronomy, and Neoplatonic philosophy. Her students came from across the Mediterranean, from Rome, from Cyrene, from Constantinople. She lectured publicly, on the street as much as in the lecture hall. She moved through Alexandria in her philosopher's cloak, a woman in a world where women did not hold public intellectual authority, and she held it so completely that it apparently never occurred to her students to find it unusual. Among those students, Synesius of Cyrene. He wrote her letters. They survive. In one, he asks her to help him procure an astrolabe, a navigational and astronomical instrument. In another, he discusses his philosophical doubts. He addresses her consistently with a word that in Greek carries the weight of both intellectual and familial reverence. He calls her mother. Synesius of Cyrene was a Christian bishop. His letters to his pagan teacher were preserved by the church he served. This detail, a bishop writing to a pagan philosopher with filial devotion, tells you something important about what Alexandria was before 415 AD. It was a city where that was possible, where the boundary between traditions was still permeable, where a Christian could revere a pagan without institutional contradiction. That world was already ending when Hypatia was at her height. Cyril was appointed Bishop of Alexandria in 412 AD. That detail appears in every account of this story. Almost no one notes what it means for the timeline. The transition from his predecessor, his own uncle Theophilus, had not been peaceful. It had involved street violence between competing Christian factions. Cyril arrived in his position already experienced in the mechanics of urban power. Already aware that Alexandria was a city where institutional authority was enforced not only through theology, but through the physical control of streets, buildings, and crowds. He moved quickly. Within a year of his appointment, Cyril had expelled Alexandria's Jewish population, tens of thousands of people, in an action that the Roman prefect Orestes formally condemned in dispatches to Constantinople. The relationship between Cyril and Orestes deteriorated into open political conflict. Orestes represented imperial authority. Cyril represented ecclesiastical authority. In a city the size of Alexandria, there was not room for both of them to hold maximum power simultaneously. Hypatia was Orestes' advisor. She was not a symbol. She was not a figurehead. She was the person the prefect of Egypt consulted on matters of governance, philosophy, and political strategy. Her influence on Orestes was documented, noted, and resented, specifically by Cyril's faction, who circulated the accusation, recorded by Socrates Scholasticus, that she was using magic to prevent reconciliation between the bishop and the prefect. Magic. That was the public framing. The institutional accusation. What it actually meant, translated from the theological vocabulary of the 5th century into plain language, was this: she had influence over a political rival, and that influence needed to be explained in terms that justified removing it. The Parabalani numbered in the hundreds. The official limit set by Constantinople was 500. Burned. That's the word the title uses. The sources use a different one. What Socrates Scholasticus describes is not burning as the primary act. It is the final act, the disposal. What came before it was slower, more deliberate. The word he uses for what they did to her body before the fire is chiro, to scrape, to shear. The ostraca were not a weapon of passion. They were a tool of methodical destruction. Someone brought them. Someone knew what they were for. That detail matters because it changes the category of the event. A riot destroys what's in front of it. What happened to Hypatia followed a sequence. Surveillance of her route, interception at a specific location, transportation to a specific building, a specific method, and then removal of the remains. Each step required coordination. Each step required someone to have made a decision before the moment arrived. The Caesareum, where she was taken, was not a random location. It had been, within living memory, a temple to the imperial cult. Cyril had converted it into a church. Taking Hypatia there was not incidental. It placed her death inside a space that Cyril had already claimed, already transformed, already made his own. Now consider what the Codex Theodosianus records. In 416 AD, 1 year after Hypatia's death, the imperial court in Constantinople issued a formal edict specifically regulating the Parabalani. The edict, preserved in Codex Theodosianus 16.2.42 and 16.2.43, limits their numbers, restricts their movement in public spaces, and explicitly removes them from the authority of the bishop, placing them instead under the direct supervision of the Roman prefect. An imperial edict is not issued in response to nothing. Constantinople had received reports. The edict names Alexandria. It names the Parabalani. It describes their behavior as a disruption to civic order. It does not name Hypatia. Imperial documents of this period rarely named victims by name, but the timeline is unambiguous. The murder happened in March 415. The edict restricting the organization responsible was issued in 416. The Roman Empire looked at what Cyril's paramilitary had done and responded with legislation. That is not the response to a spontaneous mob. Spontaneous mobs do not get their enabling organization restructured by imperial decree 12 months later. Spontaneous mobs do not prompt Constantinople to formally reassign supervisory authority over the group that carried out the violence. The administrative response confirms what the historical narrative obscures, that the people in the imperial capital understood clearly what had happened and who had directed it. He signed the form anyway. That phrase belongs to a different story, but the structure is identical. Someone at the top of an institution created the conditions. Someone in the middle organized the action. Someone at the bottom carried it out. And afterward, the institution closed around the event and continued. Cyril continued. He went on to become one of the most influential theologians in Christian history. The Council of Ephesus in 431 AD, where he presided, where he outmaneuvered his opponents with a combination of theological argument and what his contemporaries described as bribery and intimidation, established Marian doctrine that remains central to Catholic and Orthodox theology today. He wrote, he argued, he built. He was never charged. The Roman prefect Orestes, Hypatia's ally, the man whose political independence she represented, disappeared from the historical record shortly after her death. His subsequent fate is unknown. The man who had formally protested Cyril's expulsion of Alexandria's Jews, who had sent dispatches to Constantinople describing Cyril's behavior as a threat to imperial order, simply stops appearing in the documents. One of them was canonized, the other vanished. There's a letter, written by one of her students, addressed to her after she was already dead, because he didn't know yet. The letter arrived in Alexandria sometime in late 415 AD. Synesius of Cyrene had written it before he knew. He was already ill. He would die within the year.
Enjoying the story so far? Subscribe to Untold History and keep discovering the past they never told.
And he was writing to the woman he had called mother, sister, and teacher for decades. The letter is preserved in his collected correspondence, Epistle 81 in the Standard Edition. It discusses philosophy. It asks after mutual friends. It has the tone of a man who expects a reply. No reply came. Synesius died without knowing the full account of what had happened. His letters to Hypatia are the closest thing we have to her voice. Refracted, second-hand, visible only in what they asked of her and how they addressed her. In one letter, he describes her as the person to whom he brings his most serious doubts. In another, he calls her guidance the only philosophy that has ever felt real to him. He was a bishop. She was a pagan. The institution that would eventually erase her name had already ordained him. This is the detail that breaks the simple narrative. The one where Christianity arrives and destroys pagan knowledge in a single, violent moment. Synesius represents something more complicated and more damning. A world where the boundary had already been crossed in both directions. Where a Christian bishop could love a pagan philosopher with complete sincerity. And where that world was destroyed not by doctrine alone, but by the calculated decision of one man who found it institutionally inconvenient. The letters of Synesius were preserved by the Church, the same institution that would, over the following centuries, allow Hypatia's own writings to disappear entirely. Not one original work by Hypatia survives. We know she wrote commentaries on Diophantus's Arithmetica, on Apollonius's Conics, on Ptolemy's Almagest. We know this because other writers reference them. The works themselves are gone. What survives of her father Theon's commentaries, works she almost certainly edited and co-authored, survive because they were attributed to him. Her name was removed from her own work. And this is where it gets interesting. The disappearance of Hypatia's writings was not instantaneous. It was a process. And that process has a specific shape that historians of late antique texts have documented with increasing precision over the last 40 years. Maria Gielska in Hypatia of Alexandria, 1995. The most rigorous modern academic biography, published by Harvard University Press, traces the manuscript tradition and identifies a pattern. Works associated with Hypatia were either reattributed, absorbed into her father's corpus, or simply stopped being copied. In the Byzantine manuscript tradition, Texts survived because monasteries copied them. Monasteries copied what was institutionally sanctioned. A pagan woman philosopher, whose death had been attributed by a contemporary Christian historian to the Bishop of Alexandria. Her works were not going to be copied. This is not conspiracy. This is institutional logic. It operates without a directive, without a meeting, without anyone deciding explicitly that Hypatia must be erased. It operates through 1,000 small decisions made by scribes and abbots and bishops over 2 centuries, each one individually defensible, collectively devastating. The same logic that organized her death organized her disappearance from the record. What Gielska also establishes, and this is the detail that changes the political picture entirely, is that Hypatia was not, at the time of her death, a young idealist. She was approximately 60 years old. She had been teaching in Alexandria for decades. She had survived the destruction of the Serapeum in 391 AD, when Theophilus, Cyril's predecessor and uncle, had led the demolition of one of Alexandria's great temple complexes. She had navigated that transition. She had continued teaching. She had built, over 30 years, a network of students that extended across the Eastern Mediterranean into the highest levels of Roman administration and Christian clergy. She was not a martyr waiting to happen. She was a political institution. And Cyril dismantled her the way institutions dismantle other institutions. In 1882, the Catholic Church formally confirmed Cyril of Alexandria as a doctor of the Church. Doctor of the Church is not a minor designation. It is one of the highest honorifics in Catholic theology, reserved for individuals whose writings are considered of particular importance to Christian doctrine. There are 37 doctors of the Church in total. Cyril is among them. His feast day is celebrated on June 27th in the Roman Catholic Church, on June 9th in the Eastern Orthodox Church. Every year, the man identified by a contemporary Christian historian as bearing direct responsibility for the death of Hypatia of Alexandria is commemorated annually as a saint and a teacher of the faith. His works are studied in seminaries. His theological arguments, developed in the same years he was consolidating power in Alexandria through the expulsion of its Jewish population and the operation of a paramilitary force, are cited in papal documents. Hypatia has no feast day. She has no official commemoration in any Christian tradition. She has a crater on the moon named by the International Astronomical Union in 1935. She has a minor planet, 238 Hypatia, discovered in 1884. She has the film Agora, released in 2009, which was banned in several countries with majority Muslim populations and which the Vatican newspaper criticized as historically unfair to Christians. The man who organized her killing is a saint. The woman who was killed has a crater. That is not an accident of history. That is the outcome of a system working exactly as designed, for 1,600 years. The story of Hypatia is not a story about the past. It is a case study in how institutions manage threats, and how the management of those threats gets reclassified over time as something else, as doctrine, as history, as the natural order of things. Consider what the official narrative requires you to believe. It requires you to believe that a coordinated action carried out by a named paramilitary organization against a specific political target in a specific location using specific tools was a spontaneous expression of popular religious feeling. It requires you to believe that the Roman imperial government issued emergency legislation restructuring that organization 1 year later for unrelated reasons. It requires you to believe that the complete disappearance of every original work by the most prominent mathematician in Alexandria is a coincidence of preservation. And it requires you to believe that the man at the center of every contemporary account of these events deserved, 16 centuries later, to be designated a doctor of the Church. Each of those beliefs is individually possible. Together, they require a sustained effort of not asking the obvious question. That effort is not unique to this story. It is the standard operating procedure of institutional memory. Institutions do not usually falsify the record directly. That's too visible, too fragile. What they do is frame. They determine which questions are considered serious and which are considered polemical. They decide whose grief counts as historical evidence and whose counts as bias. They control, quietly and continuously, what gets copied and what gets left to decay. The Library of Alexandria was not destroyed in a single fire. That myth, the dramatic, singular burning, is itself a product of the same process. The actual disappearance of Alexandrian knowledge was slow, institutional, and driven by exactly the kind of power consolidation that killed Hypatia. Books stopped being copied. Scholars stopped being funded. The physical infrastructure of intellectual life was repurposed, demolished, or absorbed. It happened across decades, under multiple administrations, through 1,000 decisions that were each locally defensible. Hypatia's death was not the cause of that process, but it was its most legible moment, the point where the logic of the system became, briefly, impossible to abstract. A woman was pulled from her carriage in broad daylight in the center of a major city and killed by an organization that reported to a bishop. The bishop was never charged. The woman's work disappeared. The bishop became a saint. That sequence is not ancient history. It is the template. Every time a whistleblower is discredited rather than answered, every time an institution responds to documented wrongdoing by managing the narrative rather than addressing the act, every time the person who raised the inconvenient question disappears from the record, while the institution that silenced them continues to accumulate authority. The structure is identical. The tools change. The sequence does not. What makes Hypatia's case unusual is not that it happened. It is that we have the contemporary source. Socrates Scholasticus wrote it down in the same year. The Codex Theodosianus preserves the imperial response. The letters of Synesius preserve the human texture of what was lost. The evidence was never hidden. It was simply never assembled into the conclusion it obviously supports. Because assembling it into that conclusion requires asking who benefits from the version we were given instead. Someone decided her name should survive. The question is why they failed for so long. There is a specific kind of erasure that is worse than burning. Burning is visible. It leaves ash. It leaves the memory of fire. People who witness burning know that something was destroyed, and that knowledge, even without the object, carries a charge. It can become outrage. It can become myth. It can become, eventually, the kind of story that gets told for 1,600 years. The erasure that was applied to Hypatia was more sophisticated than that. Her name was kept. Her story was kept, simplified, romanticized, stripped of its political architecture, and reframed as a tragedy of ignorance rather than a crime of power. The Enlightenment rediscovered her in the 18th century and made her a symbol of reason versus superstition. Voltaire wrote about her. Edward Gibbon included her in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. The Romantic movement made her a martyr for free thought. All of that attention, all of that sympathy. And almost none of it asked the question that Socrates Scholasticus had already answered in 415 AD. Not what happened to her, but who decided it should happen, and what they gained from it. The romanticized Hypatia is, in a specific sense, as much an erasure as the silence. She becomes a symbol, pure, tragic, abstract, rather than what she actually was. A 60-year-old political operative with 30 years of institutional influence. a network that spanned the eastern Mediterranean, and an advisor's relationship with the Roman prefect of Egypt. That woman is harder to mourn cleanly. That woman asks harder questions about power. That woman requires you to look at the institution that destroyed her and ask what it is still doing. The symbol lets you look away. The actual person does not. What Hypatia's story demands, not invites, demands, is a reckoning with the specific mechanism by which knowledge gets unmade. Not by ignorance, not by barbarism, but by institutions that understand exactly what they're doing and do it anyway, methodically, across generations, until the absence becomes invisible because it has always been there. We inherited that absence. It is in the gaps in our mathematical tradition, in the commentaries that survive only as references in other texts, in the centuries during which the most rigorous astronomical knowledge in the ancient world was preserved in fragments because the people who might have copied it found the copying inconvenient. We do not know what we lost because the loss was managed carefully enough that we cannot see its full shape. That is the most precise definition of a successful erasure. Not that the thing is gone, but that you cannot tell what the thing was. Hypatia knew things we will never recover. That is not metaphor. That is the documented result of a specific sequence of decisions made by specific people, who are still, today, commemorated as saints and teachers of the faith. If a woman's entire body of work could be unmade in 2 centuries while her name survived, what else are we still getting wrong? Tell me in the comments. Next week, we uncover the secret that the Roman Empire never actually ended, and why every institution you live inside is still running its code. Her name was Hypatia. She was killed in March 415 AD in a city that called itself the center of human knowledge. The man who ordered it was canonized. Her work is gone. And the system that did both of those things is still, in every structure that matters, the one we live inside.